Hi. Today we're going to talk about the French and Indian War and how it's going to lead the colonies into the beginning of difficulties with Great Britain that will eventually lead to the Revolutionary War. Now, France and the New World we talked about briefly when we did colonization, and we know that France claimed quite a large territory in North America. But there were not a lot of settlers that came for a variety of reasons. Only French nobles were allowed to own land in the new colony of New France. And even though the French began officially in 1598, official tolerance of French Protestants, they would not allow them to immigrate to New France. So the reason, if you'll recall, a large portion of English colonists immigrated, especially to New England, was for religious freedom. They disagreed with the state church, but the French are not going to be able to do that. Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. In the late 1600s to mid 1700s, England and France went through a series of wars for a variety of reasons, and these were fought mainly in Europe, but it did bleed over into the colonies somewhat. Finally, by the mid-1700s, the colonies, the English colonies, have grown to the extent that they have pushed to the Appalachian Mountains in the west. We know that tobacco is extremely hard on the soil, and so tobacco farmers in particular are always looking for new fertile land. The obvious direction to go is to continue moving west. And so we have some early Virginians who move into or go into the Ohio River Valley to claim territory for the British. The problem is the French also are claiming that same territory, and so the Ohio River Valley is going to become the focus of the conflict that becomes known as the French and Indian War. The French began to build a series of forts in the Ohio River Valley, and the British send a young Virginian into the Ohio River Valley named George Washington to let the French know that the British have already claimed this territory and that they need to move on, that this is British territory. As Washington and his men approach, they are fired upon and are forced to retreat, and this is the beginning of what becomes the French and Indian War. Now, the French and Indian War, keep in mind, is not a war between the French and the Indians. It is a war between the British and the French and Indians. Think about what we talked about, Native Americans, and it should be pretty obvious to you why the Native Americans would side with the French. They know the British want their land. Siding with the French at this point is their best chance at keeping their traditional ways of life. As the war progresses, and I'm not going into the military history, there is no military history on the AP test. So I know for a lot of you that's disappointing. You like the different battles and strategies, etc. But we are mostly concerned with cause and effect here. One of the things that occurs during the war is the Albany Congress. This is going to be important. At the Albany Congress, Ben Franklin presents what he calls the Albany Plan of Union. Now, the delegates who actually show up in Albany, New York, approve this, but when they go home to their individual colonies, the plan is rejected. Let me talk briefly about what they proposed and then why it was rejected. First of all, the immediate purpose, the short-term goal of the Albany Congress was to keep the Iroquois tribes loyal to the British. They had traditionally been supporters of the British, and the colonists, the British, want to keep it that way. Their long-term goal, especially Franklin's, was to unite the colonies for their common defense against their French enemy. This is going to be one of the main reasons that the individual colonies reject the Albany Plan. They see it as giving up their autonomy, giving in to a larger group, specifically colonies that they probably knew nothing about. If you live in Massachusetts, it is very possible that you are not real concerned with what's going on in South Carolina or Georgia, and vice versa. So the idea of banding together as British colonies was not particularly appealing at the time. However, this is a first step in the idea that we can accomplish more together than we can individually. Results of the war, several results here. It gives the colonists experience in the British Army. So they are going to learn British tactics. They are going to get some battlefield experience that's going to come in handy later. Secondly, it's going to boost the colonists' self-esteem and decrease the view of the British in their eyes. The British were sort of this mystical, ideal society and army for the colonists until they had to actually be a day-to-day part of the functioning army. So they begin to realize that the British officers are in place because of who their family is, not because they're particularly qualified to be an officer in the army. And so the idea of an invincible British Empire is going to start to crack for the colonists. They're going to see some real chinks in that idea of that impenetrable British armor, so to speak. They also endure a lot of disdain by the British for the colonists. The colonists are sitting here thinking of themselves, they're on the edge of the British Empire. These are the cutting edge people. These are the people that are willing to risk it all to go out and get new lands for the glory and the money of the British Empire. And the British are very negative and look down upon them as backward and not as good as themselves, of course. And they're going to remember that. Why risk your life? Why risk everything for a country that doesn't particularly value you? At least that's kind of the way that they felt. The colonists also, they were not real gung-ho at fighting the British war for the British. And we do see some beginnings of colonial unity. Next, of course, by the terms of the Treaty of Paris, 1763, the French are out of North America. The Spanish had colonized. I'm tired and ready to go home. The French and Spanish had joined together to hopefully defeat the British. They both lose. And so France gives some of her holdings, like New Orleans, to the Spanish at this point. The Treaty of Paris, 1763, is the end of the French and Indian War, and it's usually the first event in the road to revolution. After the peace treaty is signed, the colonists, of course, they've won the war. They've done most of the fighting for the British in North America. And there is a major Indian rebellion led by Pontiac, and it's Pontiac's Uprising or Pontiac's Rebellion. And this is a last attempt by the natives to try to get the Ohio River Valley for themselves. They are, of course, unsuccessful, but the rebellion clarifies some things for the British. First of all, they are going to have to keep troops on the frontier if they're going to protect the colonists from Indian attacks. Keeping troops costs money, and they're going to expect the colonists to help pay for that protection. Secondly, the British decide that since this threat of involvement with the Indians is going to be so costly if there's no interaction between the colonists and the natives. Then there won't be any need for as many troops. So they passed the Proclamation of 1763, which forbids settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this should be triggering a conflict in your mind. Why did we even fight this war in the first place? To gain control of the Ohio River Valley west of the Appalachians for continued British colonization. And so the colonists look at this proclamation as, why did we even fight this war if we're not going to be allowed to move? And so in what becomes pretty typical American fashion, they do what they want anyway, and they continue to move into the Ohio River Valley against the British, or against British approval. And so what we end up with is the first event in what becomes our road to revolution. We'll continue talking about this tomorrow. We're going to look at some diaries, documents from the French and Indian War, and go Texans.